All right. So in case if this is kind of like those flights that this flight is headed for New York City, if that's not your destination. If you haven't signed up for planning clocking domains for Dante, Q-LAN, and AES67, well, that's what you're going to get today. If you were under some other impression, that's not what we're going to do. So basically, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about a lot of this is going to be focused on PTP or precision time protocol, right? And clocking. And what does that actually mean? So this isn't going to be a super deep dive into the nuances of how PTP, the history of it, or V1 versus V2 and all that. This is going to be kind of the information that technicians need to get and kind of need the basic understanding of how to properly configure your networks when you're doing different, when you're putting different types of audio onto the same network and what that does. So kind of starting out with, well, since this is going to be a lot about PTP, what is Precision Time Protocol? Well, PTP v1, it's called 1588-2002, so that's about when it came out. And PTP v2, 1588-2008 is when it kind of arrived. Dante operates in the PTP v1 category, but it can also do what we'll talk about later. It can be the boundary clock between version 2 and version 1. Q-LAN itself operates in PTP version 2 and AES67, which is Audio Engineering Society standard 67. That's just a standard of clocked audio protocols, right? So Dante, Q-LAN, AES67, these are all common clocked audio protocols that we want to deal with. In some sense situations, they'll require multicast on the network, right? We're going to utilize a process called election to determine who is our master or preferred clock leader, right? This will happen every time that a clocked audio device lands on the network. One thing to note is extremely sensitive to jitter on the network, so that's something to be aware of. And QoS will protect the PTP packets on the network. So and that's quality of service there. So a lot of times people will say, oh, we don't really need to set QoS. Our network has plenty of bandwidth and this and that. But they don't understand of what all we're going to be doing here. And we're not really going to talk a lot about video in this. This is mostly audio protocol. But PTP v1 and v2 are not backwards compatible. So what we'll have to do is, if there's Dante devices involved, they're going to require the use of what we call a boundary clock. And that's usually any device that's a PTP v1 will typically work in that case for us as well. So let's, now that we kind of got an understanding of what PTP is, let's talk about some different clocking scenarios involving Q-SYS products and other peripherals. First off the bat, the old standard there, the Core 110. I've got two Core 110Fs. These could be 24Fs if Dan updated his slides. And I have no network audio peripherals, right? So the only thing I have in here is just a core that's running one meeting room and another core that's running another meeting room, right? And they're on the same converged network there. So if we look at what this kind of looks like, the only inventory items we have here is maybe just a soft phone, right? I've got a soft phone, and kind of look at the design. We're bringing audio in via USB on the core itself. We're using the soft phone. On here on the line out side, we're going line out to maybe analog input amplifier, so we're not sending digital audio out there. These are some different things that would require us to have audio outside of that. If we had an input box or something like that was remote, or we needed to bring additional analog inputs in, that would be something that required clocking. If we had one of our digital amplifiers, that needs to clock the audio to go through the network to that digital amplifier. But in this case, we do not. We don't have any of that. So in this case, this is a very simple scenario. There will be no primary clock leader because there is no PTP clocking that is enabled, right? So if any Q-SYS core doesn't have any audio peripherals, and I think this was back around 7.2, we enabled this feature that if there's no network peripherals that need network audio, then we disable that in the design properties. So in this case, no PTP clocking is needed, so no PTP clock gets generated and just gets put out there on the network for traffic. So that's the most basic scenario, and that might happen in some cases. Really, the answer to this question is you do nothing, right? In scenario 2, we have a Q-LAN peripherals. So these are native Q-SYS devices that are going to be bringing audio into the system or out of the system, right? In this case, I'm showing, I've got listed there maybe a QIO mic line 2x2. If you're not familiar with the QIO line, it started out as a replacement for like our 4-input cards that we used to have for our IO frames and for like the Core 510 and some of those card-based scenarios. But we've moved those types of devices to being quarter rack unit devices. So there's an ML 2x2, there's which stands for mic line, 2 input and 2 output. So there's a variety of those. And then in the last year, we've released some higher density count of those. So there's some 24 inputs and all that. Just so you understand what we're talking about there on this case. So in each of these systems, we're going to imagine that we've got a Core 110 in one room that has a QIO mic line 2x2. Maybe we needed 2 mic inputs and outputs to put remotely under the table while from the rack or whatever the case is. So we have 2 systems that are like this. They're sharing the same network. So how are we going to treat these? Well, if we do nothing, what's going to happen is core number 1 in this case, and I'm going to just, is going to become what we call the primary leader clock, or and the way that this gets determined is it's determined by what's called BMCA, which is the best master clock algorithm, right? And that determines who the clock leader is going to be. And what it does is it uses a couple of different things. A few slides back, we talked about PTP priority 1 and priority 2. What this is going to do is this BMCA will go in and it will look and say, all right, both of you, what of the 2 cores that are producing clocking, what is your priority 1 set to? And if they're both set to the same, which by default they would be, it'll go to the class. And it'll look at the type of clock. Well, since they're both Q-SYS cores, they both have the same type of clock in them. And then it'll look at accuracy and the precision of the clock. Well, these aren't 2 different manufacturers or 2 different products from different manufacturers. So they're going to have the same accuracy. Then it's going to look at a setting called priority 2. So if one of those is a lower number, closer to 1, then it would choose that. Same thing with priority 1. So when you have priority 1, if the setting of one core is 10 and one is 30, well, then it's going to elect the lowest number, the number closest to 1 will win that election. The last thing is if the priority 1 matches on both, if the clock class and accuracy, which they're the same device, so they're going to have the same. If priority 2 is set to the same, then what it will do is it's going to look for a clock identifier. And that clock identifier will be the MAC address of the device is the final tiebreaker. So the lowest numbered MAC address is actually going to win that election. So there has to be a way to default to some of them, and that's the way it does. So in this case, in this scenario, what would happen is we're going to just pretend that the MAC address of core 1 is a lower MAC address than core 2. Therefore, it became the leader. Now, typically, one question that comes up here is, well, what about the IO? Well, it's showing flex ins and flex. What about the QIO devices out there? All peripherals in Q-SYS. So the only thing that we want ever to become the master clock is going to be the cores. So any of the peripherals, their default settings are set in such a way that they would never be selected. And we'll talk about that in a couple slides. Scenario 3. All right, we've got Q-LAN peripherals, and we want to give priority to one of those. So I've just been talking about PTP priority 1 and priority 2. And same type of scenario. We have one input-output device that's bringing network audio in and out, and we have 2 core processors. So how are we going to handle this? This is when, if you've ever gone in Q-SYS Designer, you can go into properties by clicking on the upper left and dropping down to the bottom, and it brings up this screen right here. And what this design properties does, we'll talk in a little bit about what, we'll get around to what domain is, but by default, it'll stay at 0. But you get the options here to set these priorities. So based on the BMCA, which that's funny, that's a best master clock algorithm. That's kind of like automated teller machine. A lot of people go to ATM machines, but it's just a pet peeve of mine. So if we look at this BMCA, what it's going to do is it's going to look at priority 1. And if the by default Q-SYS cores ship with priority 1 set to 254 and priority 2 set to 100. So in order to make one of these Q-SYS cores be the primary clock leader, what we would do is lower that PTP priority 1 on the core that I want to be the priority. I'm going to lower that to something lower than 254. In this case, we chose 100, right? So, but the defaults there, the things to remember, the defaults are PTP priority 1 is 254 and PTP priority 2 is 100. Now, if you are talking about a Q-SYS peripheral priorities would be set at 254 and 254. So they would never have the opportunity to be elected as the clock leader in these cases. So that's kind of what you'll see there. Whoops, did I just hit a slide advance? Oh, I did. There we go. So moving on to what this looks like. So when we set that, primary clock leader would be core number 2. So if we set the priority, if we go back one slide, and we'll say this is for core number 2, we're going to set core number 2's PTP priority to 100. Then what's going to happen is core number 2 is going to be the clock leader. It's going to win the best master clock algorithm based off its priority 1 value of 100 versus core number 1's priority of 254. So that's pretty basic there as well. Let's see, we've got a question in here. So, oh, great to see everyone. All right, so nothing to really answer on that one, I guess there. So,
yeah, no worries, Dan. I'm kind of typing some responses out here, but I'll jump in if something pops up.
Okay, no worries. It's all right. I'm just checking. Let's see. Dun, dun, dun. All right. So let's look at scenario 4. Scenario 4 would be Q-LAN, but we're going to put them in alternate domains. Okay, and let's just move to the next slide and we'll kind of talk about that. So I was talking about earlier that this domain, PTP v2 domain, would be set to, by default, it's always set to 0. But domains will allow multiple clocks to exist on the same network, right? And so all Q-LAN devices in the design are assigned to the domain, right? So if I've got a core and 20 peripherals, audio peripherals, everything in that system is going to be set to the specific domain that you set. And why would you want to do that? Well, you may have scenario. We're going to get to some real world scenarios at the end, but the idea is that you want to make sure that none of the clocking between these two systems living on the same network interferes with each other, and they need to be kind of standalone. One thing to remember is if you want to do Q-LAN transmit and receive, system link, or AES67 transmit and receive between the two cores, they have to be in the same domain. So that's something to look at. All Dante devices are delivered in domain 0 unless you're paying for the Dante domain manager. And if that's the case, then you have the ability to go in and segment off Dante things into different domains. In Q-SYS, it's just a setting inside of there. So let's see what that looks like. So in this scenario, what we end up with is, because they're on 2 separate clocking domains, each system is its own clock leader. So that's all it needs to be. So in core 1 and its peripherals are living in domain 0. And then core number 2 and its peripherals are living in domain 1. Core number 1 is the clock leader for its domain, and core number 2 is right there with it. So that's kind of, these are some basic scenarios. Now we're going to start getting into some things that are just a little bit more complex. And there's also some nuances in here. So some folks will be like, wait, these next 3 scenarios all look very similar. And they're very similar. And we're going to point out what the nuances there. So scenario 5, we're going to have a Dante device and put it into AES67 mode. So some people may not be familiar with this, but AES67 is and you'll notice that the equipment that we have is 2 core 110Fs. We have one IO8 flex, we'll call that as a legacy input-output device, but you might still have some out there in the world. And so we've got a 2 cores, we've got, and then we've got one UND 6IO Bluetooth device from our Aterotech line. And that has an Ultimo X chip in it. So Ultimo makes Dante chips, or Dante chips come in an Ultimo and then an Ultimo X. Ultimo was the original version, and you did not have the ability to disable the Dante portion and have it run just on AES67. Essentially, and don't anybody go quote me out on, Reddit with this one, but essentially the AES67 standard is at the core of Q-LAN audio, and it's at the core of Dante, and it's how each of us wrap our own control wrapper and everything else around that. So Dante devices that have an Ultimo X chip have the ability to turn AES67 on, whereas we also have one legacy device, which is a Dante UND 640. So it just has an Ultimo chip, and it does not have the ability to do AES67. So we're going to talk about how that's going to affect this system. So enabling AES67 turns on PTP V2 clocks in Dante devices. So now it's starting to operate in that V2 range. Because remember way back at the beginning, we said Dante lives in PTP V1, AES67, Q-LAN, those things operate in V2. So AES devices with, and this is done inside of Dante controller, devices with AES67 enabled still utilize PTP V1 for synchronization with any other Dante devices that are on the network, but all Dante devices are in 0 unless the EDM is utilized. So just remember that. Boundary clocks then will come in, and what the boundary clock is going to do is it's going to bridge the clocking and the timing on the network between the two, between PTP V1 and BTV2. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So in this case, everything here on the left is in PTP V1's domain, right? And it's so because the UNDX4i does not have the ability to come in AES67, then it is going to always remain in PTP V1. Now, when we put the 6IO into AES67 mode, it'll take the clock, depending on where the clock is, and in this case, we'll talk about this in a few more slides, it actually has become the boundary. It's the boundary clock, and it's also the primary clock leader, and I'll explain why that is in this case. But essentially, on this network, that UND64i would be clocked to the same clock as the BT. Now, we know that the core 110, at this case, would not have the ability, without software-based Dante, they wouldn't have the ability to connect to that, but these things are all devices living on one network. So in this scenario, you're going to find that the AES67 device is going to become the boundary clock. So it's going to negotiate the clock between V1 and V2 for the entire system. And it's also going to, without making any adjustments to the cores, it's going to be our clock leader as well. Scenario number 6 looks a little similar, but there's some nuances difference here. So we're going to have two, same type of scenario here, 2 cores, and we're going to, which one was this? Oh yeah, it's okay. There we go. Confusing myself here. So we got the clock in here. So the UND modified PTP priority 1 is what we're going to do in this case. So same type of equipment, and let's talk about what this is going to look like. So to have a core be your preferred leader, the PTP priority is going to have to be set. So if we go back to this example right here, we have a wall plate serving as our clock leader for all of these systems on this network. And that's not always the best thing to do, right? And so the way that we can negotiate that around, now it's still going to be the boundary clock. I keep wanting to call it the border clock, the boundary clock. But what we want to do in this next scenario is we want to be able to move that priority over. And the way that we do that is we would go into one of the cores. In this case, we'll say core 1, and we're going to set that PTP priority 1 to something lower than 127. And I'll tell you the secret of why we want it lower than 127 is Dante devices by default have a PTP priority 1 setting of 127. So by default, Q-SYS cores come out at 254 on priority 1, and priority 2 is set at 100. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our Q-SYS core, and we're going to set core number 1, and we're going to set that priority to something below 127. In this example, we've set it to 100. You can also go into, there's great things to read about Dante audio in the Q-SYS help file. So some of this is detailed in there if we don't have all of that in there. But what we end up with at the end of this one is we've removed that primary clock leader from being here with a wall plate that could be unplugged, could be disconnected, whatever the case may be. And that would then call for an election. So if a primary clock leader leaves the network or dies or gets disconnected, then there will be a disruption in all the rest of the audio. It might be just a few seconds or a few milliseconds, but it can cause audio disruptions while the rest of the cores are deciding, well, who's our clock leader now? Who's the leader of this band, right? And that's kind of what we're looking at here. So in this case, it makes sense to move that to something that's permanent, maybe not a wall plate. And also the other thing too is some of these chips have limitations on how many devices can clock off of them as well. So things to be aware of that make good sense. Let's look at scenario 7. We're actually going to enable in scenario 7, same hardware configuration as the last couple, but we're going to enable software-based Dante. So this is something that we added in several years back, and there's some great benefits to it. I think this is one of the best benefits is the ability to be able to move that boundary clock that actually does the translation between V1 and V2. Let's move that from that wall plate, just like we moved the master clock over, or the primary clock. We also want to move that boundary clock. And so we're going to do that by using software-based Dante in the core. So software-based Dante will enable PTP V1 and V2 clock on the core. The PTP domain only applies to PTP V2 devices because you must use DDM to change PTP V1 domain settings. So we're not going to be doing that. Core will act as the boundary clock now between PTP V1 and V2. One thing to remember is you're unable to run separate V1 and V2 clocking. So if you need to have separate V1 and V2 clocking, you may have to look at, and I don't even know that we have our Dante cards anymore. So if you could find a Dante card and put it into one of our 510Is, that would be how you would separate that. Let's say, for instance, you had a big performance venue or something like that, and you want to have your Dante on a completely different V clocking situation. You can do that with the card-based Dante. So there's going to be some limitations in acquiring that, but.
Hey, Dan, really quickly, do you mind if I jump in with a question from Chester Hull?
Yeah, let's see what we got.
Yeah, so in this scenario, Chester's wondering, where would you see which device has been elected as the clock leader in order to know whether they need to change the clock leader or not, like from the wall plate to the core in the scenario 6 example. So where would be a good place to view that? In my opinion, Dante controller is a great spot to look to kind of tell you the hierarchy, but just curious on your opinion on that.
Yeah, you can also do that. It's also in Core Manager. I believe it'll come up and tell you which one of your cores is in the status block of the core will tell you what device it's actually clocking to. So if we look at let's see, just something like let's take a look here. Oh shoot! Well, I was going to try to bring up a live one, but I don't have my Reflect collections connection set up. But essentially, if you go into the status block of your core, that's where you would find that information at. So it would tell you in there. Let's see if I can just open up a status block. All right, yeah, I can. Let me just share this over here. Pull this over. But in here, it's going to tell you who the grandmaster clock is. So let's see if I can, you can click and zoom by hitting scroll in there. So right in here, it's going to tell you what the clock master is. And then the light is going to be lit on if this device is actually the core. So hopefully that helps.
Cool. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah. Sorry, I always got long answers. This webinar has few enough slides that we can pause and give deeper answers. So
we love a live webinar.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. So scenario 7. Oh my gosh, look at this. Our core has become the boundary clock, or the boundary, not the the boundary clock. So it's going to decipher between V1 and V2. It's going to handle that for us. But what we're going to end up with is the UND6IOBT is going to be the primary clock leader in this case. So what we want to do is we want to move that. Eventually, we're going to want to move that, and we'll talk about how to do that. So default PTP priority in the core prevents it from winning the BMCA, right? So just as a default, that's where it's at. So what we want to do here, scenario 8, software-based Dante with a PTP priority. Same kind of scenario. We're going to disable AES67 on these chips, and we're going to look at what we do here. So we're going to come in. We already know that the core is going to become the boundary clock, and we're going to just go in and we're going to set this priority level to something below 127. This slide looks a lot like the last one, and we're going to go in there. Now, one thing that it's not showing here. Let's see, I don't know if we're going to get to that, but I'm going to bring it up while this is here, and I might repeat myself on another slide. But you'll notice here that there's also a setting for Q-LAN in here. So anytime you're on a network that has Dante on it, what you're going to want to do, even if the Dante devices aren't part of that network, you're going to want to set this value down here from Q-LAN to Audinate. And by switching it to Audinate, what you're going to find is these QoS values here. So we're going to get a little bit off of clocking, but into QoS. But this is important because we're talking about Dante and being on networks with Dante. And what it is Dante assigns a value in QoS. The higher the number, the more likely the value. Let me just bring that core back in here. I'll bring it. It'll be easier to see what we're doing. Oh, this is a live one. So if I go down here, not preferences, I need one that's off. Cancel. Let's grab this one. We want one that's not online. So if we go down here and we go to File and we do Design Properties, you'll see here, let me close this out and get us to a blank part where you guys can see that. Whoops. Boy, oh boy, I really need someone that knows how to use a computer around here. So, all right, let's scroll down here and do it here. There we go. Get some better contrast on this. So I can't zoom in and make this any bigger, but by default, this is set to Audinate. And when you set it, if you change that to Q-LAN, you'll notice that the PTP value, so the clocked audio packets are going to, the timing packets are going to be given a priority of 46. 34 for audio DSCP value, and then video 26. So, but Dante sets its devices so that the PTP v2 is 56. So it has a higher priority. So anytime you're on a network with Dante, you're going to want to set this. Like for instance, our training desks in the Experience Center, they don't have any Dante on them, but we have them all set for Audinate because they're living on a network where Dante is being translated as well. Then there is an option here of manual, and that's if you're in some unique situation, and I know I've heard of it maybe on like cruise ships where they're sharing one huge combined network and there's radar timing and all kinds of other things. So you might, this gives you the ability to manually tweak that. But by default, the ones you'll see mostly are if this core is not on a network with a bunch of other cores, or with any Dante devices, leave it at Q-LAN. If there's any Dante devices on that same network, do that there. So, all right, so hopefully that clears that up and we'll kind of move on. So that's
Yeah.
that's one thing that's important there.
Hey,
Eric?
real quick, one more question. Just curious, from Reflect, can you actually see the clock master quickly? Is there a quick reference to that without logging into the actual core manager itself? Is that a feature of Reflect is a question that just popped in.
Oh, well, let's
I was
see.
double checking that. Other than getting into the core itself, I am just double checking on that. So,
Yeah, I think you have to get into the core manager of that system. But let me log into my
that's
Reflect
what I
account.
believe as well. But just
Yeah,
I'm gonna double check here.
yeah. It's one of those, as soon as I say, oh no, they added it in the last upgrade to
Right.
Reflect or something like that. Oh, and we got a shill in the audience that's testing us or something like that. Oh boy, it's struggling to get on there. But I'm 99% sure that, if you look at my Reflect accounts here, like there's nowhere if I go to Austin, I can't see who's the clock leader in on that network, right? I've got to actually choose one of our cores, right? So, if I go into that core, I can look there and then I can determine from, so status, it's going in there. Reflect procedures. So yeah, you're going to need to pull the design file of it and be able to see that. You might be able to see different things in the event log where it'll say, so and so became the clock master thing. You'll see notes like that, but there's nowhere really there. So you really need to look in the status block itself, though. But great question.
Thanks.
Yeah, no sweat. All right, so let's go to scenario number 8, software-based Dante with PTP priority, right? So in this case, we're going to bring it all to the core, right? So we go in, we lower that PTP priority that we did back here on scenario 8, we lower that, and then our end result is these devices out in the field are not the clock leader nor the boundary clock. And so definitely one of the benefits of using software-based Dante. Let's talk about a few real world scenarios here. Let's imagine that you have, it's the basic conference room. Well, it's a little more basic. It's got a big high power digital amplifier in it, but it's got a line array in there. So perfect. But we've got a in-ceiling beamforming microphone, nondescript. We have a Q-SYS core. We have a couple of Q-SYS audio peripherals and an audio amplifier as well. So in this case, by default, the primary clock leader is going to become the ceiling. The ceiling mic is going to do that without touching anything, right? So, and that might function okay. It's just a conference room. If the mic goes down, it's probably not as functional as it should be anyways. And so this may work just fine. If you wanted to change it, you know how to go into the core and set it to be the clock leader by lowering the PTP-V2 priority 1 down to something below 127. But let's look at a different scenario. So in this scenario, this is part of a portable system. And by using the BCMA, by just the way things turned out, this microphone that's part of this portable system is now the clock leader. What happens when this system goes on and offline? It's a portable system, so it gets taken down. When it gets plugged in and we've got, meetings going on in these other 4 rooms, whoever has using the BMCA has chosen, it's one of these is going to be the clock leader. And then when this system gets plugged back in, it's going to have another re-election, and then we're going to have audio outages. So this may not be the best scenario here. And what we would want to do on that is we would want to go into core B, core C, core D, whatever, one of these other cores that's a stable system that's not portable. And let's set that to setting that PTP priority 1 to something below 127. So that's a real world case there. So let's say we've got a large paging system, got a redundant pair of cores. You're going to want to set by default your primary core as the primary clock leader. When it fails over, the other core will become the clock leader. You're going to have a small little blip of audio outage there anyways when they switch over, and it'll just switch the clock. Now the system's running great. This is at the name, insert name of financial company here, field or something. And paging systems working great. And then somebody says, well, hey, up here in the owner's suite, we really want to be able to have some Bluetooth music, and the co-owner suite wants it too. So now somebody says, well, this awesome Q-SYS system, I can just drop a couple of their Dante plates in and we can do Bluetooth connections right here. We got some local analog. This works great. Well, the problem is now we have this, 70,000 seat financial facility, whatever, sports arena being clocked off of a single wall plate. Not a good idea, right? So what would we want to do in this case? Well, there's a couple things we want to do. First off, we want to try to migrate the boundary clock and the clock master to the cores that are in the system. And so what we would do is we would implement software-based Dante and set the priority 1 value of PTPv2 to something below 127, and that's going to move it here. I mean, we can all see where this would be dangerous to have the entire paging system of a facility clocking off of a wall plate. So let's take a look at another scenario here. Campus building. So we've got classrooms here, and then we have this Dante device for remote inputs for auditorium events over here. So if you set nothing up and you just needed to have a USB interface in the auditorium and to send Dante to the auditorium, you're end up getting all of this stuff is going to be clocked off of a small peripheral. Not the best scenario. So let's talk about some ways that we can use this. We've talked about a lot of tools. There's nothing in the system that says that classrooms 1, 2, 3, 4 or the building PA system need to talk to each other. They're not sharing audio between systems, not doing anything like that. And the auditorium, this input is only for auditorium events. So what we can do is we can go in first and we can utilize domains, right? So because this is the only system that has Dante in it at the auditorium, we're going to leave it on domain 0. And so by setting the classrooms 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the PA system 3 and the PA system 2 different domains, their clocks are only going to exist in their own little networks. They're not going to affect elections on any of the other systems or devices, and that's going to work out great. And then the last thing what we want to do in the auditorium is we'd want to go into that auditorium core processor, and we would want to set the PTPv2 priority 1 settings to something below 127. So that it will then become not only the boundary clock, but it will also become the master clock as well.
Cool. Hey, really quickly, Dan, before you jump to the next slide here, we're getting some great questions. So thank you all and keep these coming. This is good. I'm going to address one or two really quickly, and then we will jump to some of these as we get towards the end as well. So keep them coming. We will answer them. But really quickly, starting at the bottom of the questions here, is there a place to see which device is the active boundary clock? Kind of a quick and easy reference for that, Dan.
All right, which one? Let's see here. Oh, to determine who's the boundary clock. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be where is there a place to see which device is the actual boundary clock? Well, it's going to. That's a good question. I'm gonna have to look up that one and see. Actually, yeah. I think that the way we configure our Dante, we typically want that to do. We want it. It allows for that boundary clock to move there and become the V1 processor. But yeah.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. And then we'll do one more really quickly, and then we'll jump to some of these towards the end, just so we can keep tracking if that's cool.
Yeah. So, well, we've got one more slide, and then it's questions, so we're fine.
I'll tell you what, let's burn through the slide, and then we'll jump back in here if that's cool. So
yeah, no problem. So yeah, the last slide is just kind of a quick overview of planning. Clocking is an important part of the design process, right? PTP domains can be used to break up clocking within a particular subnet. So that's something, a lot of times I'll tell a story that comes along with this one is there is a major nationwide gym company that uses our products, and they have Core 110s. While they run their buildings off of a bigger processor, they have studios that they do like spin classes or live exercise classes or things like that. And those are revenue generators. So what they decided to do was they put a small core processor in a rack in those rooms. They're not tied. They're not just an offshoot of the building processor. Well, we had one where the network jack that the core was plugged into was actually kind of faulty. And so because none of the PTP priority was set, that core was the clock leader. And so when they'd like move the rack, the whole audio would kind of come down for a few seconds and back up into this facility. And like, what's going on with this? And, we ended up going back and say, well, we don't want this peripheral, it's not a peripheral, but this other smaller system that is a little more vulnerable. Let's make the main processor that's running the whole building be the clock leader. And that way, when these other systems join or unjoin, to do that. So that's why the domains, so that's why priority is so important in there. And we could also break those up. They didn't need to get audio from anything, so they could be on different domains in that as well too. So software-based Dante will allow for the core to be the PTP v1 and v2 leader. I think that, to go back to that last question, I think there's something inherent in what we've done in the way software-based Dante communicates, that if you add software-based Dante to a core, it's going to become the boundary clock for that. And so hopefully we're doing that. So, but that's kind of the reminders there, and then we'll go into questions. And so I'll go ahead and, well, I'm going to leave the slide deck up because sometimes it's good to go back and refer to something that's on there. So we got Q&As dropping in all right here.
Cool. Yeah, we're getting some great questions here. So we'll start back at the top here with Alan. Sorry, Alan, I missed you a minute ago. So we'll start with this one. It's kind of a two-parter here. So we understand that the core will be the boundary clock between V1 and V2. V1 still goes through the BNCA to select the leader and the other devices on V2 sync to the boundary clock, ? And then the part 2 is also priority 1 and 2 values. That's not the PTP v1 and v2. Remind me of what those values are.
Yeah, okay. So let me try to dissect this because there's a lot of terminology that's in there. So the core will be the boundary clock between V1 and V2. And it still goes through to elect the leader. And so V2 is, without Dante's domain manager, you can't affect anything on the PTP v1. So what happens is you're changing the priority on PTP v2's priority 1 and priority 2. And those values are anything below 100. So Dante V devices have a PTP v2 priority 1 value set at 127 or 128. So we need to be 127 or lower for that to be there. And so that's what those values are there. And that, so that should take care of that one.
Deal. All right, sweet.
It seems that there's a difference referenced in the manual for PTP v2 domains between 1 and 3 and 4 and 127. That is going to get a little deeper than what I understand and know. I just, the rule of thumb for entry-level folks dealing with building Q-SYS networks with this would be, you need to know you need to be under 127. Can certainly dive in and do some deeper thought in that. But so I'm not really quite sure what the difference is between for those 1 through 3 versus 4 through 127. But I would say you typically will have the ability to get, using between 4 and 127, you should have the ability to set your core as the clock leader there. So we can certainly dive into that if we needed to. In the campus building example, if all systems you use in Dante, would you have to use separate VLANs to keep audio multicast from talking to other rooms? See, I knew there would be a good time to look at this slide. So let's see, let me close this real quick. We'll go back a few slides. So in this one, so what we're doing by putting these on separate domains, we don't really need to VLAN them because the clocks will only stay inside of that domain. So in this example, the reason with them in each domain, that's the beauty of it, is that you won't get interference between the two of them. So hopefully that answers that correctly. Whoops, I hit stop share. Not what I wanted to do. All right, we'll keep that up. And let's go to, I keep piling them in here. Always lots of good ones. So there you go. That one should, let's see. So if the campus putting default systems using Dante, would you have to use separate? No, you don't have to use separate. So we answered that one live. Are the domain settings used in lieu of separating networks via VLANs? Yeah, I think that could be one of the reasons why you might do that. So, you know, all of this is living on the same, you've got an AV VLAN and you just want to separate it. You know, this should work up to, I mean, this will work up to, you know, systems that are really of larger sizes and you just don't want things talking to each other. Maybe even if you had 6 different, you know, systems running on one network, you'd want to do that. What is one of those classrooms in the last scenario needs to get audio from the auditorium? Live music on stage, studio recording in the classroom. Yeah, Justin, great question there. So in this if classroom 1, let's say, you know, wanted to be able to pull, you know, this is the performing arts classroom and they want to be able to pull in audio from the auditorium. What you would do in that case is you would set the domain of classroom 1 to 0, and then you would set your PTP priority here at something, you know, you might set this one at 128 or 127 or 126, and you might set this one at 127, right? Or you just want to make sure that the auditorium, the bigger, more stable system is in there. So that's how you would do that there. So correct me if I'm wrong, the clock leader would be determined in Dante controller if Audinate is selected in design properties. I don't know that is true or not. I believe you may be able to affect that if you have Dante Domain Manager in there potentially. But I can't give you a great answer on that one. So I'm at the fringe of my knowledge on that. So, but I would potentially, if that is a possibility, maybe it is in there. So when you're using Dante Domain Manager, but we are using Dante, but we have our domains set up for 1 domain per building, 1 per floor. Should we be setting up domains by individual rooms instead if we don't need audio to flow between rooms? I mean, if you're not having issues and your rooms are all stable, I don't think that that's a best practice. I think that you could, you know, if you have enough domains, but you know, you could do it that way. It probably breaking up by building and floor, you know, looking at, if I'm on a campus, right, and I've got, you know, 600 classrooms across the campus, well, I'm going to run out of domains, right? So what you could do in that case is you just set up domains per building or floor and just make sure they're not interacting with each other. So that should work out great. Let's see, if you have a system that is changing clock leaders frequently and causing processor overruns on a BICS Dante Q-LAN, what is the most likely suspect? General network instability, traffic not separated well enough from the rest of it. Yeah, that very well could be, Kyle. I would say that going back and checking your priorities right and all of that, and it just you might be, if you've got all that priority stuff right and the domaining set correctly, it might be something dealing with how traffic's being separated on your network there. So,
right. Sounds like kind of some general network switch configuration issues potentially. So definitely check that out. We have some best practices posted on our website as well that are great for reference. And you know, feel free to reach out to integrator or someone on the Q-SYS team if you need further help with a network deep dive.
Yeah, and so Brian Schwartz says, but you mentioned Dante needed to stay in 0. So Dante doesn't have to stay in 0. It's just you have to have Dante Domain Manager, which I believe is a for-cost software, in order to make Dante operate in a domain outside of 0. So that's what we would do there. Did you guys make the designer on the Dante input side to not use Dante controller, but why not on the transmit side? Oftentimes the transmit side of the Q-SYS side cannot be found in by the controller? I know this is not a troubleshooting session. Just
Yeah, that's a great question. I
did
don't
you
have a solid
mention
answer on that one, Dan.
designer on the Dante input side to not use Dante controller, but why not on the transmit side? So I think you're saying, oh, I see, because you're transmitting. And so I think from the receiving side, you can choose what ones you want to see. I think we're referring to the fact that I'm trying to get to the meat of the question, which I think is, you have the ability in Q-SYS Designer to enable. Let me just pull this up and let me take a look real quick and see. Let's see if I've got. Let's sort by type. And do I have any software-based Dante in there? So let's see. Pull this over and scour a little bit. So audio inputs. Yeah, let's see. It's a good question. I like it. Yeah, so on the output side is, all right. And boy, let me cue this up and then we'll take a look at what it's doing there. Wow, it's still massive. Okay, cool. So I think what the question is asking is on the input side, the receiver coming in Dante, we have the ability in here to set the priority to, you can set the block up to where it is where you can
External
actually
configuration.
do the configuration here. You can choose what Dante streams you're receiving, right? But when you go to the Dante outputs, there is no way to choose that. We don't give you that ability because this is just outputting audio. So the receiving device would want to do it. So it is, I mean, to kind of answer the question there, I guess the intent was, that you wouldn't know where you want a source to go. That's more a property of a receiver in the system would be the way I would think there. So let's see, I can't get there. It popped out. Let me pop the questions back up here again.
A couple
We're
left.
getting there. Thank
Yeah,
you
burning through
for
'em.
sticking around. All right. How many of these domains does Q-SYS offer? So without using Dante Domain Manager, you would only get the domain 0. So you'd have to go in and change that using Dante Domain Manager. But unless you're talking about domains just in Q-SYS itself, let's see. And then, like we said, I believe that tops out at design property up to, so we have default domain is 0, you have alt 1, 2, 3, and then you can go all the way up to 127 different PTP v2 domains that can be used there. So, and that's in the preferences section of there. So, all right. Which end of software-based Dante establishes the clock, a transmit or receive? If I have a multi-core Q-SYS system and I want a master processor to be the PTP clock leader, but it doesn't actually have any Dante traffic in or out this core, do I need to include a TX or RX or both in order to establish it as the clock leader? So to be the clock leader, you don't have to have software-based Dante in or out of it. But what you have to do is set the priority right to be the clock leader. Now, if you want it to be the boundary clock, then you would need to, you can use either a transmit or a receive. So, but that's for a clock leader. But if you want it to be the boundary clock, then you can add either a transmitter or a receiver into the design, and that will allow it to be the boundary clock. But just to be the PTP clock leader, you don't have to do that. Should I use a separate external clock to feed PTP v1 and v2 to separate networks for Q-LAN and Dante? I mean, so it depends on the complexity of the system. I will say this, that in our larger experience centers, we have processors that run, each of the spaces in there. I'm thinking of like Costa Mesa off the top of my head, if anyone's been out there for training. But like, we have a demonstration conference room. We have a fireside chat kind of experience room. We've got the lobby. We've got a training room. And each of those are running on their own separate cores, core nanos on those. And then what we've done is we've added we call it the MDF core, but that MDF core does two functions. When different systems need to talk to each other, we put system links, any sources that need to be spread between all four systems go to the MDF core. But it's also, we set the priorities and everything on it so that it's the clock master for the facility as well. So it can be done with simply adding, a small form factor core to be able to run that. But there's really no need to add separate clocks to do that. But in a really large, performing venue or something like that, you may want to have a clock in there that does that. And that certainly that works as well too. So from my previous, boy, talking's easy for Dan today. From my previous question, I'm almost out of words. It's 10:59. So
Yeah.
in a large redundant system with a single clock domain, why would you not want the redundant core to be the master? If it fails over, all of the peripheral devices would not have to reclock. It's a redundant core with less load and standby. So I always like to give an example on that. So when possible. All right, why is this not letting me click anything?
And guys, thank you all for the questions. These have been great. So this might be our last one. We're approaching the hour. So thank you for these. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to either of us at some point. But this will be the last one for the webinar.
Yeah, so I'm going to come here and I looked up redundant in the dictionary the other day and it said C redundant. So what happens is when we do a redundant core, we don't have the ability to configure that second core because it's all seen as one device. And when you set the properties for a design file, you are setting that for both of them, right? So there's going to be an amount of time that it flips over to that other core in the redundant core position. And at that point, it's going to renegotiate anyways. So that's why you would want to do it because, we don't have two different inventory items here that come up as cores. So that's kind of why you would want to do that. So hopefully that answers that. Do we have some thank yous or do we have one more here? Oh, previous question there. So, all right. Well, boy, I don't know what's going on there. Oh, cancel. I'll stop my sharing. So we really do appreciate it. Sorry if I left a couple of open-enders there a little bit. Like I had said at the beginning, this is a kind of an entry level to just some best practices there, but obviously there's nuances and situations. Feel free to reach out to one of your local application engineers or solutions architects, or even, if you're having what you believe to be clocking issues, our support team is there. There's also plenty of, there's some great training if you go out on our training website, training.qsys.com. There's some good network configuration videos and some best practices out there to use as well. So yeah, so we really appreciate you guys taking the time. How do we receive our CTS credit? So what you'll get done when you get emailed, that's a great question. You'll get emailed with this, a link to be able to take an exam. It's like a short 10-question exam. In the next day or two, our marketing department will send you not only a recording link of this, but you'll also get that link to an exam. So, and then once you take that, you'll get a certificate, send that into Avixa, and you'll get your renewal credits. So perfect. Anything else, Eric?
Dan, I think that's all of them. So yeah, thanks again for joining, everyone.
All right. Thank you, guys and gals. Have a great day.
Cool. See ya.